All right, thanks very much, Kelly, and thanks to the organizers for having me. I just to give you a little bit of background about myself, I'll go into more detail about my history in a slide or two, but I'm at Rutgers, which is the State University of New Jersey. It sounds like it should be a small college, somewhere off in the boondocks, but we're actually midway between New York and Philadelphia. And the reason that I sort of volunteered to give this particular talk was because I think a you know a career in a degree in astronomy is something that you can take in many different directions, and we try to really emphasize these days that what all of these directions are, whether it's data science, national security, finance, or what have you. And these can all be very rewarding. And in fact, a number of my former students are working in these different areas at present. But I also think that sometimes we talk so much about these quote unquote alternative career paths that students don't necessarily hear that much about the realities and the pluses and minuses of what has been considered a traditional career path in academia, which is sort of going from being a student to being a postdoc to being a faculty member with different ranks. And so I thought a little bit of discussion might be interesting to have with this group. In particular, for those of you who are current NAC students who are perhaps in the process of applying to graduate school, where you have to write a personal statement and talk about what your long-term career goals are, or for those of you who are NAC alumni and who are thinking, at this point about whether your long-term career goals, are what you thought they were when you were applying to graduate school. I hope this discussion will be useful to you. And so I figured the way that I would do this would be to sort of provide about, a few more minutes of background from myself. And then basically, I've been told this is possible, that we'll turn the recording off, and then we can have a very frank Q&A session where you can ask me whatever you want about, my experience as a professor, or the various steps that I had to take on my way to get to be a professor, and hopefully have a really good exchange of information that way. So just to provide a bit more detail on my own personal trajectory. So my undergraduate degree is in math and physics. I then got a PhD in astronomy, which is now over 2 decades ago, which is kind of incredible. And then I had 2 postdoctoral appointments. These are appointments where you basically spend your entire time doing research. One of them was in Germany, just outside Munich, and the other, I was actually an employee of the National Radio Astronomy Observatory, but I was based at the University of Maryland. And then in 2006, I started as an assistant professor at Rutgers. I was on sort of a typical 6-year contract where basically they could have decided that they didn't like me at the end of that and gotten rid of me, or they could have given me a permanent, what's called tenured position. Fortunately, they gave me tenure at the end of that. And so I've been an associate professor, and then most recently a full professor. I put undistinguished in quotes here because there's actually an even higher rank at Rutgers called distinguished professor. And because I'm not a distinguished professor, I think that means, logically speaking, I must be an undistinguished professor. So that's what I am right now. So this is sort of a representative example of a traditional career path, quote unquote. But one of the things I want to emphasize is that there's a lot that you don't see when you look at this history for me, or the similar histories for other people. You don't see the many moments of uncertainty that I experienced at different points along the way here. For example, there was a point in college where I was really concerned that I would not get into graduate school at all. And so my childhood dream of becoming an astronomer would just, go up in smoke. I also had sort of a lot of uncertainty about what kind of astronomy I was interested in doing, which didn't really kind of clarify itself until I got to graduate school. And the other thing that you don't see here is that there were a lot of rejections too. There were rejections when I applied to graduate school. There were rejections when I applied for postdocs. In fact, I think that second postdoc there, the Jansky postdoctoral fellowship, I only was able to accept that because 3 or 4 people who were ahead of me on the list all declined it. So I sort of sneaked onto the wait list that way. So I'm just putting that out there because I know sometimes, if you're a younger student or scholar and you look at sort of other people's CVs and they look, really impressive and stuff, there's just to keep in mind that there's a lot that you don't see when you look at people's sort of typical presentations of their history. So about being a faculty member, which again is what I've been for the last 15 years. So faculty members are, in very general terms, hired and judged based on contributions in three areas, which are research, teaching, and service. And service is sort of stuff you do out of the goodness of your heart for your institution and your profession. I would say that at large universities, where I would define that as universities that have graduate programs, which is the case for Rutgers, research is the most important of these three pieces. And sort of succeeding in research as far as a university is concerned means that you're publishing research papers, you're securing grants from agencies like the National Science Foundation or NASA that can help support graduate students, you're actually mentoring graduate students, and then you're also sort of building a reputation with other scientists around the country and around the world who work in your area. Teaching is valued, but it is definitely secondary. The service piece is necessary at some level, but it's actually quite easy to let that swallow all of your time if you're not careful. And so kind of pacing yourself is generally a good idea. At a smaller college, teaching is a much more important part of this package. And I would say, from talking to colleagues who are at these institutions, that having an active research program is still required, it's still expected, but there's a lot less pressure to secure grants, for example, because you don't have typically graduate students who you are trying to support through this, through your activities. So before I actually became a professor, I'm sort of putting myself now back in the mindset that I had, in the early 2000s. I thought I would like to be a professor for several reasons. The first was that I really wanted working with students, both as a teacher and as a mentor, to be part of my job description. There were other sort of career paths available to me where I could have done that as an extra thing, but I thought, this is important enough to me that I really want to be judged on, on something that make this an official part of my job description and be judged on that. I also wanted to be able to initiate and execute any research projects that interested me. My particular area of research is galaxy evolution, which I do mostly at radio wavelengths, but some at other wavelengths too. And then I also like the idea of a job that had a fair amount of independence and maybe, fingers crossed, if I made it through that 6-year initial period, some job security over the long haul. So that, as I said, was my perspective before I became a professor. How about the reality after becoming a professor? So it's mostly positive, fortunately. It's worked out pretty well. The first thing, the thing that is kind of the most important statement on here is that I have really, really loved both teaching and mentoring students in research, both undergraduate and graduate. That's just been an enormous source of personal satisfaction for me, and I've just been really lucky in the students I've gotten to work with. It also turns out that I have a terrific set of colleagues, especially the other astronomers at Rutgers, but also the physicists in my department. This just was kind of good luck that the place that offered me a job had good people to work with. So this certainly wasn't a guaranteed thing. I have been able to work on a number of interesting research projects, including sort of going off in some completely new directions. And the job security that came with getting tenure, which was back in 2012, actually did make me feel able to give back more than I had been doing to the community. So for example, I started an REU program at Rutgers and ran it for 6 years. And that's something that, if I did not have the long-term job security, I would not have felt able to do. The not so positive realities, for me at least, of being a faculty member. The first is I just still feel like I don't have quite enough time to do everything that I want to do. I just feel like, there's all this stuff I want to do in research. I want to be a good teacher. I want to do sort of different types of service in the community and at Rutgers, and it's just hard to fit everything in. I probably should learn how to say no to more things, which so it's maybe partly my fault, but I think it's also partly the nature of the job. I think the second thing that's a source of stress is that I really feel a lot of pressure to deliver grant support to my graduate students so that they can continue to be funded to work on their PhD theses. So far, not to jinx things, but I've mostly been able to do that. But, every year there's another deadline and, another, graduate student who is depending on me to write a successful grant proposal for them to be funded. So that's, something I probably will be living with for the rest of my career. And then the last thing I'll just say is that in any large and complex organization, change can be very slow. And so, there are some areas where I would like to see astronomy change. There are some areas where I would like to see Rutgers change. And, you have to persuade a lot of people. You have to sometimes persuade different people who are in the same, you persuade somebody one year and then, somebody else steps into the job, and then you have to persuade that new person, which you persuaded the old person the previous year. And so that's just that is a little bit of a source of frustration from time to time. And that is basically what I wanted to say, just to introduce myself and introduce the topic.